Welcome everyone to today's Archives Alive lecture, Shot Down and Hiding Out with the Resistance, the Keith Patrick Archive at McMaster University Library. My name is Ruth Ellen St. Onge, and I'm the moderator for today's session. I'm the Distinctive Collections Cataloging Librarian at the William Reading Division of Archives and Research Collections. Today's lecture is part of the Archives Alive series, a partnership between McMaster University Library and McMaster's Alumni Department. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that McMaster University is located on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. As we look ahead to Indigenous Veterans Day, which is tomorrow on November 8th, and Remembrance Day on November 11th, we can reflect on the contributions of the thousands of Indigenous soldiers and personnel who served in the First and Second World Wars, and on the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis service members and veterans of our own time. I am very pleased and honored to present today's speakers, who are my esteemed colleagues at McMaster University. Bridget Whittle is the Digital Archives Librarian at McMaster University. The main focus of her work is developing strategies and workflows to ensure that archival computer files can be read now and long into the future. In addition, she specializes in the university's extensive First and Second World War materials and the small collection of medieval manuscripts. Saman Goudarzi's work operates at the intersection of information science and critical geography. She's particularly interested in the ways in which community-owned and governed infrastructure can contribute to equitable knowledge systems. Currently, Saman takes care of McMaster's Lloyd Reed's map collection, ensuring community members are able to access, understand, and use the collection for teaching and research. So Bridget and Saman will deliver the lecture, and after they complete their presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A session during which you can ask questions. The session will be recorded, and if you would like to send in a question during the talk, please use the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I will hand things over to Bridget and Saman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth Ellen, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for joining us today. We feel so very fortunate to have this archive as part of our collection and to be able to share this incredible story with you today. And in particular, thinking about this is looking at archives, both sort of what's in them and what they can sort of jump off to. So these talks are often about the archive itself, but then what we can learn more. So I'll be covering part of Keith Patrick's life, what his service looked like, some of the things that happened to him, and then Saman will look at particularly the maps that were involved in his experience and how we can learn more from them. So let's begin with the beginning. Keith Patrick was born on September 22nd, 1918, to Hugh and Lily Patrick in St. John, New Brunswick. He ended up being one of six siblings, and the family moved to the US about the time that Keith was 10 for work. It was, common enough, fairly close, easy to get back and forth. And so Keith finished school there and began work. And while he was there, he met Phyllis Taylor, who will show up throughout his experience in different ways. And so I'm just sort of slipping her in right now. But the key bit, of course, was the beginning of the war. War was declared in 1939 in Canada, but of course the US didn't join for a number of years. And so in order to enlist, he and his brothers returned to New Brunswick. And in the end, 5 of them all joined. They all became members of the RCAF. Keith trained as a wireless operator and air gunner. He went to wireless school in Calgary and then bombing and gunnery school in McDonald, Manitoba. From there, he was moved overseas to England, and initially he was part of operational training units doing some teaching and ferry command in England. And then after that, he went to Malta and then ultimately Egypt and other parts of Africa with the RAF 108th Squadron. he was very fortunate while he was in the RAF 108 to be joined by his brother Edmund. This is them pictured on leave in Bournemouth. And so much of the experience of most people is, of course, being separated from family and friends. And, you know, of course, forming bonds with people you're with, but how lucky in some ways that he could be with his brother, though they weren't on the same crew, they were able to be in this unit together, which must have been a great sort of source of comfort to both of them. Um, Another way, of course, that people connected was through letters and care packages. And while he's serving in Egypt, he gets this lovely care package of a knitted vest and socks from Phyllis in the heat of June. Initially, I think it seems like sort of a funny timing. He's glad to get it, of course, grateful, but day to day, it doesn't immediately seem useful. But of course, it's actually so cold flying at altitude, especially at night. And as yet, they don't have full flight suits. They just have sort of a uniform. And so he wears the vest under his jacket and it helps, and the socks, and they help keep him warm while they're up in the air. Having Edmund with him is, of course, a great joy, but it also leads to a certain degree of terror at the same time. On the 19th of October, 1942, they're on a bombing run and they receive a distress call. And Keith discussed this in his memoirs. He says, I heard the distress signals coming from Edmund's plane. They faded, and we did not know what had happened. I was given the choice of going down to look for him or going ahead with the operation. I found myself carrying on and worrying my head off about my brother. And he finishes the mission. They land. He has the terrible job of writing to his mom to say, this is what happened. We sort of know whereabouts he landed. It was probably landed okay. There's a pretty good chance that our guys will find him and be able to bring him back, but they don't know. And in the end, he won't know for almost a year. Edmund's plane does land safely, but it doesn't. It's not Allied folks who find him. Edmund and others are taken to prisoner of war camp in Italy, and he's there for the better part of a year before he and others in a mass escape manage to break free and get to safety. Edmund and Keith will be reunited in November of 1943 before Edmund's sent home. Shortly after this lovely reunion, Keith himself is given leave. In January, he's sent home. And he goes and with his mom goes to Massachusetts to visit Phyllis. And while they're there, he and Phyllis are engaged. At first she thinks actually that he's joking. But when she sees that he's serious, she agrees. And so with that sort of warm thought, he then ends up going back to England. For his second tour, he gets some additional training from folks in England. And a lot of this is what we'll talk about in terms of where they got their tools for escape and evasion. And part of what we have from his archive, which is so incredible, I've never seen it in any other archive, is parts of his escape kit. It would have been a larger package than what you see here on the screen. But as you can see, there would have been basic things. A lot of lessons were learned from the First World War. The real understanding was that making sure soldiers were fed was really important. And so a lot of his kit is related to food and things like that. But also, as you can see, there's fishing line, some small saws. There would have been matches. The little tablets are for water purification, and the larger ones for sort of anti-fatigue pills. If you really had to keep moving, keep running for a long time, this was to help get you through. A razor to help keep yourself shaved, fishing line, things of that nature, and of course a little compass there in the bottom left. And this training would actually soon come in to use. Patrick joins the 427th Lion Squadron, and on the night of the 12th of June, he is one of a number of squadrons. He's playing there, a number of squadrons that are on a bombing mission to Arras to bomb the rail yards there. And unfortunately, they run into some issues. There's some problems with the instructions for the flight plan, and they overshoot. and they have to come back. And the consequence of being some of the last ones to arrive, even though they managed to successfully complete their mission, is that they can't sort of, they're not there as a group, and the defense has been raised. There's anti-aircraft fire, and a number of fighters have been scrambled to try and shoot them down. So they drop their payload and then are trying to head back to England, but they're being followed by fighters. And first they're trying to evade. Their tail gunner, Frank Lang, is shot and killed, and soon the plane is on fire. And so Don Fulton, the pilot, pulls them up to a high enough altitude because they recognize that they're going to have to jump with their parachutes. So he pulls them up to a high enough altitude to do that. And Bunny Wilson, whose name is Lyle, but they all call him Bunny. He opens the hatch and he holds it all for them, and one by one, the six members who are still alive at this point jump out. Keith is the last one to jump. Before Bunny, he's second to the last one to go, and he jumps, but his arm gets caught on the hatch. It caught right at his wrist, and he says he feels like he hangs there for minutes. There would have been bullets flying, maybe anti-aircraft flak, things like that, and it feels like an eternity. It was, he says, probably only seconds. He sort of reaches up, tries to free himself, and eventually the cuff and his watch give way. He loses his watch, and he falls. And he doesn't remember anything. He wakes up a few hours later. He doesn't remember pulling his ripcord or anything like that. And it's very clear when he wakes up that he's in terrible shape. He feels awful. All he can do is sort of gather his parachute in to keep warm from the damp ground, and also to try and minimize the likelihood that he'll be found, because when he wakes up, he can see that there are soldiers searching for him. He can see their silhouettes in the light from the fire of the plane, but all he can do is go back to sleep. And he wakes up some hours later. It's daybreak by now, at least. Of course, without his watch, he doesn't quite have a solid timeline. He's still in terrible shape, but he knows he has to get moving. He's injured. He can't really stand. He figures either he hit the plane on his way down, maybe from that sort of caught exit, or because he was unconscious by the time he reached the ground, he couldn't properly catch the force with his knees and legs, and so he's maybe fallen on his back and neck, maybe on his head even, because it'll turn out that he's actually fractured the base of his skull. His shoulder or collarbone are broken. He's in really poor shape. He tries to stand up, blacks out almost immediately. He has to walk basically almost doubled over on his hands and feet. Consequence of jumping out of the plane, he's also lost his boots. And so he's doing all of this walking through fields and sort of rough ground with only his socks on. His feet are really unhappy. But he manages to make it towards a road. And just as he's almost to the road, he hears a German patrol coming, and he manages to hide. He uses that training. He gets into a ditch. There's sort of a wall there. He manages to sort of take cover. And the patrol passes. They don't see him. He's lucky. When he's sure he's safe, he gets up, he crosses the road, and makes his way over to a farmhouse. And this is the Hochart family, who will be the first people he meets. And he's in such terrible shape that he sort of is just kneeling on their doorstep, and he bangs on the door, and someone opens it and then immediately closes it. And he doesn't know what's going on. Inside, they're trying to decide if he's an enemy combatant or someone friendly. He sees a bicycle leave, and he goes, "Oh, I'm done for sure. They've sent for the authorities." But then the door opens, and they help him up. They carry him inside. He's in awful shape, black and blue with bruises, and they lay him down on a first floor in a first floor bedroom under a window. And this is, of course, a great risk to them. The Germans are still out searching. They, in fact, come as close as the fields of their farm. But thankfully, no one approaches the farmhouse, because just a glance in the window would have been obvious that he was there. They can't really communicate with each other. They're trying to figure out even some basic things like whether he's hungry or not. They can't quite do it. And then a woman shows up, and this is Gabrielle Gruel, pictured here. She's only about 20 at this time, but she and her whole family are part of the resistance. And as a result, she's learned some English. She's able to communicate with him, and so she starts asking him questions about who he is, his crew, his plane, things like that. Keith doesn't know who she is or that she's the resistance and isn't sure that he can trust her, of course, so he doesn't say anything. And finally she says, okay, I'll be right back. And she leaves. And when she returns this time, she comes with a cigarette wrapper, and on it is written Don Fulton's name in his handwriting. And she says, he's with me. He's at my house. And so Keith's like, okay, I can trust her now. And he's relieved, of course, to know that Don is safe. Still don't know what's happened with anyone else. And there's a discussion, and it was decided that Don and Keith should be moved. That the Hochart family, it's too dangerous for them to stay with them. They have a number of young kids, and the dangers that they would all be shot, of course, is so high. And Gabrielle, with her connections, is able to take him to the Fillerin family. They've helped a number of other people. And so it's determined that they live not far away in Ronti, and so they'll take them there in a wagon. And Louis Hochart will drive the wagon, and Gabrielle will go with him. The wagon, if you can picture it, is sort of like really big wheels with a box sitting on top. So high up, which is good. They fill it with straw. Don and Keith are laid in the back. Keith has to be carried, of course. He still can't really move. He's blacking in and out for the whole trip. And they put a tarp over it, and then they set out. And it's a few kilometers of a trip. It's not so far, but in a wagon, probably not the quickest. And on their way, they run into a patrol. And Hochart is quite concerned. Gabrielle says, it's okay, I'll do all the talking. And one of the ways that Gabrielle and her family have been so successful is by seeming to be friendly and helpful to the Germans who are there. And she's learned some German, so she can communicate with them. And so when they see her, they recognize her and go, "Oh, have you heard anything about this downed Halifax bomber? Have you seen any soldiers, anything like that?" She says, "Oh, no, I haven't heard anything, but I'm going to visit my aunt. I'll ask when I'm there, and when I come back, I'll let you know." And the whole time that this is going on, apparently Keith, in his sort of incoherent state, keeps pushing at her elbow. And I sort of picture she must be sort of have her elbow resting on the corner, maybe of the wagon. And he's sort of under the tarp pushing at it because he can hear talking, but he can't quite figure out what's going on. And so she manages to carry off this conversation, lying through her teeth and all of this. And one of the people she tried to protect, sort of pushing at her arm. But the soldiers, she does an amazing job. The soldiers buy it. They let them go. They don't even check the wagon, which, of course, is a miracle because they would have been easily found then. So they make it safely to Ronti and the Fillerin family, where Don and Keith will stay for the rest of the time. The Fillerin have been helping throughout the war. They're part of the resistance. The father and mother, Norbert and Marguerite, at this point, by the time Don and Keith arrive, they've been arrested. They've been taken away. They'll end up in a concentration camp, both of them. And while they survive the war, both of them will suffer quite badly as a result of this. So when they arrive, it is just the grandmother Kede, the daughter Geneviève, Monique, and son Gabriel who are there, who are all teenagers at this point. And one of the roles that the grandmother does is she takes used old inner tube tires and makes the stamps for things like this false identity paper that's seen here on the screen, which was what they gave to Keith ultimately. But first, of course, they had to make sure that he would live. They managed to get a doctor to see him, and the doctor doesn't have a good prognosis for him. But he says, and Keith isn't willing to go to the hospital because he's, of course, concerned that, again, he'll end up in custody then. And so the family agreed to take care of him. And Monique, in particular, takes great care of him over the next few days, and he begins to recover, which is essential because Right now, he is, of course, a great risk to them all. They can't move him quickly, or he can't move if there's a search. And so the whole family is sort of waiting and, on tenterhooks while this is going on. Once he begins to recover, he and Dawn are sort of left to their own devices during the day. The family have to continue to go out into the field to do work. This is, of course, both necessary to continue to feed themselves. There's not a lot of food going around. The community is very good about sharing what they have. When an animal is slaughtered, they share it out. But they have to continue to work the fields to get the food that they do have. So that means that Dawn and Keith have to pay attention to what's going on and get themselves out if they don't have warning. Because the family is part of the resistance, often they have notice if someone is coming, and so they're able to take them up into some forests where they're situated with First World War rifles that are still lying around, and are able to sort of prepare a defense if they need to. They never need to use rifles, but they often have to hide for days or for hours, if not over a day. And when this happens, either in the fields or out in this forest, the girls will come by and just as they're walking, casually drop hard-boiled eggs and some water for them to have some sustenance while they're waiting. Over time, they learn that not only have they survived, but Bunny Wilson has also survived. He's nearby with another family. And so this is a lovely picture of the three of them, Bunny, Dawn, and Keith. So you can see Keith's wearing a knitted vest, and that is the same knitted vest that Phyllis made for him, which I loved, that just survived the war. They're all, of course, trying to look more like regular sort of French subjects. So they're still wearing a lot of their uniform items, but they've added other pieces to try and make it look more like they're farmers. There's not a lot of extra clothes to go around, so Keith is still wearing most of what he was shot down in. The only thing that the family were able to really give him were some boots, since of course he'd lost his. Day to day, they hide or get out of the house when they need to. There's a couple of really close calls. One of the times they're really not able to get anywhere, and Keith just hides behind a door, and he's just lucky that he's not seen. But of course, they also know that troops are moving towards them. D-Day had happened even before he was shot down. Their bombing was part of that movement. And so on the 6th of September, 1944, they're finally liberated. The 4th Canadian Armored Division rolls in. A group of Canadian, Polish, and English soldiers are there to liberate them. And you can see here on the bottom, this sort of celebratory group. So some of the soldiers that were part of it, as well as members of the Felleran family and their neighbors, and all of them sort of getting together to celebrate. There's a big party. They stay overnight. They have a great time. And then the next day, it's time for Keith to begin leaving. And it's quite an emotional one. Bunny and Dawn leave pretty quickly, but Keith owes so much to these people, and it's so clear when you're reading his memoir how much it's the people who matter. And so after many tearful goodbyes, he finally goes. He's, after various things, he's taken to England to a hospital to be checked out. They determine that there's not maybe much that he can do about his injuries, or that it'd be quite risky. And eventually then he makes it home. He's back in North America, late fall 1944. He retires as a flight lieutenant in 1945, despite his willingness to return. And the end of the war comes, and then he begins his civilian life. He and Phyllis get married in June 1946, and they have 3 children. But in many ways, the war, he remains sort of tied to the war in a different way. He goes on, has a job, has a life, but he remains both connected to the RCIF. And I really love this picture of him and Phyllis at the RCF Memorial Museum in Trenton. They took this in 2005. And this is Keith pointing up at the hatch of a Halifax Bomber, no doubt regaling Phyllis there with the story of his jump. And so much of this is key, both the training he received once he was on the ground, but then, of course, the people who helped him once he was there. And He and many others joined the Royal Air Force's Escaping Society to raise funds for the people who'd helped them, recognizing that without them they wouldn't have survived, but that they did it at great peril to themselves. Many, of course, were killed, and those that survived often had lingering effects, and or their families did as a result. And so they wanted to give back to that. Keith goes on later in life to write a memoir of his war with the help of his daughter Janet, and then with the encouragement of his family, especially his son Philip, who goes with him. He goes back to France and is reunited with a number of the people, which is really wonderful. They get more details and fill out the story. And despite suffering from pains, headaches, and sort of shocks of pain from his jump, Keith lives to the incredible age of 102. And so we're very fortunate then to be able to share this story with you now. And it's a result of all of those people's support, but especially to his preparations and the preparations that went into it. Well, he maybe didn't use a lot of his escape kit. The work that was there involved really helped him and others survive. And so we're going to hear more about the maps that really helped Keith Patrick. And I'll let Saman take it away.
Thanks so much, Bridget. So let's talk about the maps in the Keith Patrick collection because they're quite unique and I think they warrant their own discussion. Chris Long, who's the original archivist working on this collection, he reached out to me while he was processing this archive and he said, Saman, you have to come down and take a look at these maps because I've never seen anything quite like them before. So I went down and to take a look at the maps. Bridget, can we do the next slide, please? Thank you. And these were some of the maps that I saw. And Chris was right. While I like to think that I've seen a lot of different maps throughout my career, I had yet to see maps like these. What stood out immediately to me was that these maps were printed on fabric as opposed to paper. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of one of the maps in the collection so you can get a better idea of the materiality. These maps kind of feel and act somewhat like a handkerchief or a scarf. It might be hard to tell from this picture, but it's worth noting that both sides of the item have been printed on. So you get two maps in one. I'd also like to emphasize here that maps inscribed on cloth is not a 20th century invention. One of the earliest surviving silk maps dating back to the 2nd century BC was excavated from a Han Dynasty tomb in China in 1973. So what really caught me off guard was the fact that Keith Patrick possessed so many of these cloth maps. Of course, what I didn't know at the time was that the Second World War was perhaps the most prolific period for cloth map production. These maps were produced in great numbers and given to Air Force crews flying over enemy-occupied territory, or they were encapsulated in things like playing cards, books, gramophone records, and board games, so they could then be smuggled into prisoner of war camps. So once I got over the shock of the number of cloth maps in this collection and started to examine the actual content of these maps, I realized something felt off and I couldn't put my finger on it. That is until I started to compare these maps to the other World War II maps we have here at McMaster. Next slide, please. Thank you. So of course, I have to take a moment and shamelessly plug the incredible map collection we have here at the library. Some of you may already be aware, but if not, we do have quite an extensive collection of military maps here, which of course includes many of the maps that were produced by the British during the Second World War, like this one on the screen here of Istanbul. Some of you may beg to differ, but I find this map incredibly easy to read. The color scheme for one is intuitive. Blue means water, green is vegetation. I can easily tell when this map was produced because there's a date on there, and the map's sheet number, NE 40/26, makes sense. While it might seem like a random mash of letters and numbers, it's actually part of a well thought out numbering system that makes it easy for me to figure out what map I'll need to look for if I wanted to view the Turkish-Greek border just the west of the area depicted on this map, for example. Next slide, please, Bridget. Thank you. These maps, however, are not as easy to read. Basic cartographic conventions like titles and dates are missing on some of them. The numbering system for these maps don't make sense at first glance. They actually do feel like a random mash of letters and numbers sometimes. All of this to say, when I saw these maps and started studying them, I was very confused and frustrated. When I started studying them, I came to learn they were officially called escape and evasion maps. But it wasn't until I started digging into their production history that I realized the reason they were so confusing to me as a cartographer and a map librarian was because they weren't made by map makers, at least not initially. These escape and evasion maps and several other items that Keith Patrick had on him, including his escape kit that Bridget showcased earlier, they were created by a branch of the British intelligence service called MI9. Next slide, please, Bridget. Most of you are probably familiar with MI6 of James Bond fame, the UK's foreign intelligence agency. Well, MI9, or Military Intelligence Section 9, was created during World War II to help with escape and evasion efforts. Fun fact, the section of British military intelligence responsible for creating operational maps, like the one I showed you earlier of Istanbul, and responsible most really for most other geographic matters for the British military, that was MI4. Some of you may have heard terms like Geographic Section of the General Staff or the Directorate of Military Survey. I'm going to use these terms interchangeably here with MI4. There are nuances between these different iterations of British military mapping operations, but they don't really matter for this short presentation. All of this to say, MI6 James Bond, MI4 they make the maps, MI9 they do the escape and evasion. MI9 was relatively a newer branch formed at the onslaught of World War II as British intelligence leaders recognized the need for formal government infrastructure to support those caught behind enemy lines, like Keith Patrick, so they could make it back to Allied territory. Next slide, please, Bridget. So MI9's creation is partly the result of changing military attitudes regarding escaping capture. Prior to the 20th century, escaping capture was seen as cowardly. If one was captured, it was the result of personal failure and therefore deserving of public disgrace. However, the British began to realize the value of escaped prisoners of war during World War I, as service people who escaped or evaded capture would return back to Britain with vital intelligence, things like enemy military strategy, anecdotes about new technologies or secret weapons, battle plans, the position of troops, so on and so forth. The return of successful escape and evaders would also provide a morale boost for those at home. So, in the span of a couple of decades, frontline forces now had the directive to attempt to get back to Allied lines should they find themselves in enemy territory. But it wasn't enough to just tell folks, do your best to evade capture and try to escape if you happen to get capture. There was recognition that official government support was needed in order for this directive to be successful. Next slide, please. This sentiment is perhaps best illustrated by Winston Churchill when recounting his own experience as a journalist in the Boer War about 40 or so years before the start of World War II, where he was captured and ultimately attempted escape. Churchill wrote of his experience, "I was in the heart of the enemy's country. I had 75 pounds in my pocket and 4 slabs of chocolate, but the compass and the map, which might have guided me, the opium tablets and the meat lozenges, which should have sustained me, were in my friend's pockets in the State Model School." Because it's not a World War II presentation if Churchill isn't mentioned at least once. Next slide, please, Bridget. So MI9 was created with this philosophy in mind on December 23rd, 1939, with 2 main objectives. First, to facilitate the escape of British and Commonwealth prisoners of war from enemy territory, and second, to return those who had evaded capture behind enemy lines. MI9's operations were divided amongst its subsections and included the training of personnel on escape and evasion, the interrogation of returning escapers and evaders, the planning and organization of escapes, and perhaps most pertinent to our talk today, by the production and issuing of escape aids. There were numerous people whose labor made sure all of these parts of the operation ran smoothly, and that those serving, like Keith Patrick, had the training and the tools necessary to escape or evade should they need to. Major later turned Brigadier Norman Crockett, the head of MI9, was one such person. While Crockett had served during World War I and was even decorated, he himself had never been captured. However, he did see the value of including the expertise of those who had been captured and successfully escaped in his team. And he appointed many to lecture on escape and evasion at MI9's training school, or to help set up and manage escape lines. These are networks that would direct escapers and invaders back to Allied territory. With the focus of my talk being on Keith Patrick's escape and evasion maps, however, I'd like to highlight MI9's technical officer, Christopher Hutton. Next slide, please. So during his time with MI9, Hutton invented countless gadgets to aid in escape and evasion. Compasses hidden in uniform buttons, compasses hidden in pens, compasses hidden inside cat badges, compasses hidden inside smoking pipes and pens. Essentially, lots and lots of compasses, small enough to be concealed as everyday objects. He also invented saws that could cut through 1-inch steel bars and be hidden inside shoelaces, and military boots that could be converted into civilian footwear should they need to be. But perhaps the invention Hutton is best known for is the escape kit that Keith Patrick had on him when he was shot down. It might not come as a surprise for some of you then that Hutton was one of the inspirations for the James Bond character Q, the head of research at development at James Bond's MI6. There's a lot that's been written about Hutton, that he was eccentric, a genius, wayward, and didn't comply with ordinary military discipline. One of Hutton's MI9 colleagues wrote that at one time or another, Hutton was in trouble with MI5, MI6, Scotland Yard, the customs authorities, the Bank of England, the Ministries of Food and Production, and several local police forces. His methods were certainly unorthodox. Hutton was also really fascinated by magicians and loved the art of show business. He was deeply interested in escapology. There's this really charming story about a 20-year-old Hutton challenging Harry Houdini to escape from a wooden box built in real time on stage in front of an audience, thinking that he'd best Houdini. Little did he know that Houdini had bribed the carpenter before the show had even started. So Hutton was obviously a lot of things, but what he wasn't particularly knowledgeable about was maps. He had decided early on in his tenure that maps should be a priority for MI4, as it would be impossible to escape or evade without one. There's still a lot we don't know about MI9's mapping program. Much of what we do know is thanks to the work of cartographic researcher Barbara Bond, who spent considerable time reconstructing the program based on surviving records. In fact, much of this presentation draws from her work, and I highly suggest reading her book, Great Escapes, if anyone is interested in further exploring this subject. But Dr. Dr. Bond, who has perhaps provided the most comprehensive look into MI9's mapping program, has gone as far as to call Christopher Hutton cartographically ignorant. Despite escape and evasion maps being flagged as a priority, Hutton and even MI9 more broadly were not particularly familiar with cartographic techniques, processes, procedures, or even the existence of the military map makers working in MI4. Part of this ignorance could be attributed to the fact that while MI9 was based in London, MI4 had moved to Gloucestershire at the beginning of World War II to avoid the threat of German aerial bombardment. However, Hutton didn't let any of this stop him. He managed to identify individuals and companies that could help with his project and ultimately approached commercial map publishing firm Bartholomew and Son for help. Ian Bartholomew, aside from giving Hutton an introductory lesson in maps, provided him with their own maps and printing plates of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, forming the basis of MI9's initial round of map production. Bartholomew went so far as to waive the copyright fees for the maps, a significant financial gesture considering that over 300,000 copies were produced. One of these maps made our collection via Keith Patrick. Next slide, please, Bridget. So this map here is of Cyrenaica and Crete. It's been torn. How or why exactly, we're not sure, but it does demonstrate the ability of these maps to maintain their intellectual integrity despite physical wear and tear. At the start of MI9's mapping program, Hutton had initially envisioned printing these maps on paper. He tried to find paper which was thin, could be folded and unfolded indefinitely, resistant to the elements, and soundless when hidden inside uniforms. After consulting his contacts in the trade, however, he became convinced that such a paper did not exist, so he turned his attention to fabric instead. As a result, the Bartholomew maps were initially printed on silk. Next slide, please. So here's the other side of this map, K2, which extends the geographic coverage to the west and south to include parts of North and Central Africa. As you can see, Bartholomew's escape and evasion maps were produced in only 3 colors, red, black, and green or gray, making them hard to read. If you look closely, you'll notice that no elevation details are included on these maps, which isn't ideal for someone planning a potential escape. So there was an increasing awareness in the military that these maps could be improved upon. And as the war effort went on, more escape and evasion map series gained approval. With these new series, MI9 began to engage with map makers from MI4. This could in part be attributed to MI4's move back to London, allowing MI9 greater access to existing operational mapping materials, including established maps like the GS series. Next slide, please. Barbara Bond has identified 5 other escape and evasion map series that were developed after the initial production of the Bartholomew maps. Keith Patrick maintained one of the maps in these series, specifically Series 43, named as such because of the use of the 43 as a prefix for the map numbering system, which is believed to refer to the year in which production commenced on these maps, 1943. As we can see on the screen here, Keith Patrick's maps depicted northern France, parts of Belgium and Holland on one side, as well as southern France, northern Spain, and the German-Swiss border on the other. We believe this is the map he had on him when he was shot down. As you might be able to tell by looking at this map, these sheets are multicolored, which points to a vast improvement with MI9's fabric printing process. I should also note that all of the maps in this series appear to have been printed on man-made fabric instead of silk. The sourcing of silk became a major problem for MI9 as the fabric supply was significantly impacted by the conflict caused by the Second World War. So MI9 needed a suitable medium that could replace silk in the production of their escape and evasion maps. When the United States joined the Allies, MI9 ultimately gained access to US-made rayon, producing many of their maps with the fabric. Series 43 maps were specifically made, by paneling together maps from the International Map of the World series that was most likely held at MI4. Next slide, Bridget. Thank you. So the International Map of the World was a collaborative international series proposed by German geographer Albert Pink, with the aim of creating a map of the entire globe using a standard set of cartographic conventions. The larger map on the right is from a 1954 edition of the series, and the smaller map on the top is its index map, demonstrating the grid used to section off the globe for detailed mapping. The idea is that if you put all of the map sheets, like the one of London on the screen here, together like a puzzle, you'd have a very large map of the world, all using the same standard and conventions. Next slide, please. For reasons that remain unclear, MI9 decided to cut sections of these different maps from the International Map of the World series and panel them together to make these Franken maps. This practice created significant production problems and caused much angst for the military map makers when they eventually did become involved with the escape and evasion mapping program. They thought that the production of these maps would be much simpler if they adhered to the existing lines originally outlined by the International Map of the World series rather than the arbitrary lines created by MI9. Who knows what the folks in MI9's mapping program were thinking with this decision? Next slide, please. In fact, there's still a lot about MI9's mapping program that we don't know. I'm using another one of Keith Patrick's escape and evasion maps to help illustrate this point. The source of this particular map on the screen here of northern Italy, it remains unclear. While the map's coloring scheme of green, red, and black is reminiscent of the Bartholomew maps we saw earlier, the map itself is in the Italian language as opposed to English, suggesting that it's based perhaps on a native Italian map instead. Despite there being elements of the program that remain unclear, we can be certain of one thing. The program was incredibly prolific. It has been conservatively estimated that over 1,750,000 maps were produced as part of MI9's mapping program to help escapers escape and evaders evade. By the end of the war, 35,000 members of the British Commonwealth and American Armed Forces who had either been captured or, like Keith Patrick, found themselves behind enemy lines, managed to return back to Allied territory. And while we can't be certain of the extent these escape and evasion maps were used by all 35,000 of them, numerous successful escapers and evaders recounted the maps as being their primary escape aid. And I think that's quite an achievement for what started off as a cartographically ignorant military branch. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Saman. That was so interesting. And now we have enough time for questions. But just before we do that, I do want to take a brief moment to thank Keith Patrick's family, and in particular his daughter Janet, who worked with him, co-wrote his memoir. Their decision to give it to McMaster means that we can share it with you now. And the addition of that memoir really helps to fill in and illustrate the records. So often I work with a lot of our war records and they tell a story through the documents, but there's always pieces missing, especially due to censorship and things like that. So people couldn't often say all of what they were doing. And so the ability to work with these documents along with the memoir is really incredible opportunity. And we're really grateful. But now I'm just going to stop sharing and we'll answer some questions if you have them.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Bridget and Saman, for this amazing talk, which I knew was going to be thrilling. It was even more thrilling, exciting, and informative than I expected. So for everyone who's with us today, I've shared two links in the chat. One to a library online library guide to the escape and evasion maps, and then the second to the Keith Patrick Fond, so that describes in a great level of detail what is actually in the archive of Keith Patrick here at McMaster. So I would please ask everyone to feel free to pop your question into the Q&A section. We do have one question that was asked during your talk, and that was Keith Patrick's memoir published?
Yeah, so they self-published it. I'm actually not 100% sure on its availability. That's a good question. We have a copy, so you're welcome to come look at our copy. And then, you know what, I can see if I can find out, and we can send that information out when we share the talk later on. You'll get a link to the presentation, and so I'll find that out and we'll send that. That's a good question. It's a great read. It's absolutely incredible. I highly recommend it. It's very readable.
Okay, it looks like we have another question. Um, We have a question here saying, first of all, this is awesome, which I agree. And thank you for sharing. Is there anything in Keith Patrick's archives from which we can learn about his experience as a wireless operator, particularly after being shot down? For example, did he lend expertise to the local resistance?
Hmm. Um, from what I saw, not he didn't have much opportunity to share that sort of expertise with it. In fact, it was clear that he was trying to find ways to help out. He tries to help clean some of their farming implements and gets reprimanded by the grandmother for using water and they'll rust. So unfortunately, he didn't really get much of a chance. I think by that point in the war, probably the resistance had really ironed out a lot of their needs. But I'm sure that he absolutely was willing. It's very clear from his memoir that he would have happily helped if he could have. But in this case, it doesn't sound like it from what I saw.
So, and we have another question. So, asking why did the family decide to donate Keith's records to McMaster?
Oh, that's a very good question. And of course, I wasn't the processing archivist on this. Chris was. Um, I believe they're all alumni of MAC, and I think that's partly why, and partly too because we have a number of other war records from this time, and it really helps support the understanding of that. As I said, this, especially his escape kit and his story, it's unique in our collection, and we're so lucky to have it.
Yes, and I would like to point out that everything that Bridget and Simon have talked about here is here in the archives and the library, and these historical documents that we hold here at McMaster, we hold for the public and for current generations, future generations. So they are meant to be freely accessible and to be shared so that these histories can continue to be known and understood. Um, so I think we have another question, but in the meantime, I had a question for Saman, which I might have missed, but were these maps given to like infantry as well, or were they more intended for pilots?
From what I've been able to gather, they were mostly intended for pilots during sort of early on in the war effort. They found that a lot of pilots, like Keith Patrick, were being shot down and were finding themselves in enemy territory. So these a lot of these escape and evasion kits, as well as the maps, were mostly directed to them to be able to find their way back.
Yes. Um, there is a question about how maps are made, which I think might be too detailed an answer for uh, to handle in this format. But I think so. The map they're asking if the map is drawn by hand or with mechanical means, and I think Simon, you would agree that these are printed. And please feel free to answer in more detail.
Yes, I did mention Barbara Bond's book. She does make mention of a number of a couple of manuscript silk maps. So these would be maps that would be drawn by hand, but the vast majority of the maps that were sent out to service folk throughout the war effort were printed using plates.
Great. Looks like we have some more. I'm just um, answering one by text. So we have this. Yes, this presentation is recorded and will be available on YouTube. Um, if you would like to learn more about tours and seeing, like having a group come to visit, please email us at archives@mcmaster.ca. And then we have a question about how we preserve these escape maps as they are textiles and do they require special care?
That's a fantastic question. We're very lucky at McMaster to have a in-house conservation lab with folks who are much smarter than I am in figuring out how to preserve these items. There's like chemistry involved. It seems like magic. For the most part, and Bridget, you can correct me if I'm wrong. After I think most of Keith's maps were actually in very good quality. They maintained the family and Keith had really maintained them well throughout their lifetime. So they didn't require any sort of special treatment, and they're just laid flat in our map cabinets with, I think, Mylar around them to just protect them.
Yeah, I think that covers it. It's a testament to how robust these were that after all this time they came to us and were in very good shape, but it's also clear that they all took care of them very well. We've certainly had other things come that have worn through use or what have you. But yeah, they are. Yeah, we keep them flat so that they don't, where there's wrinkles, that's where they would break down. And so we have some support from our conservation lab for that.
And there is a response from the family saying that the memoir is available from the family. I think the email is included in that response, so you should be able to see that on your end as an audience member. And then we have one of our participants pointed out that their father, who was a radio operator in a tank, had an escape map. And then we also we had some comments that came in during the talk about some other audience members who were sharing their own family's experience and the kind of documents they had. So that's lovely to hear those details.
Yeah, we have only, I think previous to this, we only had one other silk map in the collection. That was with someone who did espionage work. I think we only had, but that was the only one I'd ever seen. And so it's clear that not only airmen got them, but they were certainly I think the most common to receive them from everything Saman said.
So we do have a pretty general question, which I think both of you might have answers for, but if asking what your favorite or mo the most interesting item is in the collection, I guess, in addition to this fascinating archive of from Keith Patrick.
Um, Sorry, I was reading the chat.
Okay.
Could you say that one more
Uh,
time? This is the problem. Too many
this
things.
this is a fun question about what your most favorite or item is in the collection. That so maybe as a way as a
Great.
to encourage people to see what else we have here at McMaster.
Sure. I'll start, though it's hard to pick just one. When I very first started, I was so delighted to discover what we have. We have a message sent by pigeon from the First World War, which, of course, I learned about in school, but I don't know. The materiality of it was something totally incredible. It's on incredibly thin paper that would have been, made very small and stuck in a little pouch on its leg. And then the other one, other than I'm very attached to our medieval manuscripts, but in keeping with the theme, my actual favorite object is there's a gentleman who served in the First World War as a soldier, and then later on in more support capacity in the Second World War. But at some point during his time at Vimy, he made a little case for a matchbox out of material. It looks like shrapnel, probably he used and sort of fashioned it into something. And so he's inscribed it with the date and things. And I remember taking it out of the box, shaking it, and it rattled. And I was going, oh God, I don't know. I have no idea what I thought was going to be in it, but I was terrified it was going to be something horrifying. Anyway, I gently opened it. You could tell that the end of the box had been pushed open a bunch of times. It's slightly dented, but I opened it. Inside with this tiny little Scotty dog figurine, which I just imagine being a little good luck charm that he carried with him, both throughout the First and then maybe the Second World War. So those are two of my favorites, but it's actually really hard to pick. We have so many incredible methods.
Yep. Swan, any final thoughts on a favorite thing?
I'm going to give the answer I always give, which is the humble fire insurance plan. For those of you who are not aware, these were sort of very, very detailed maps of urban areas that were created kind of throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. And they just build to the building level, you would get an idea of what the fabric of a city like Hamilton would have looked like in 1911, for example. So they're a great way for folks to see how the places they live in, like Hamilton, Toronto, Cambridge, have developed in the last 100 years. And it's really fun to just go and find your house and see what it used to be. So, and we have them here at our library, but also many libraries have them. So if you're not here, go find your local library. I'm sure they're there.
I'm also going to put a plug in for them being online. I
Yes.
love them. They're an incredible resource, and especially, yes, worth seeing what was happening at your location 100+ years ago.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that's it for today. I'd like to thank our two speakers for sharing this very fascinating story, which helps us think about and remember the contributions of so many people, from those who designed the escape kits to the very courageous French families who helped shelter these service members and pilots who were risking their lives in this conflict. And many thanks to the families who have, kept these documents and artifacts. And now we're so privileged to have them at McMaster, where we can help share them with community members, students, anyone who'd like to see them. So thank you so much. This will be available on YouTube in a couple of weeks on the McMaster YouTube. Please fill out our survey after you attend the talk. It helps us to plan future events. And we'd just like to thank you, and let's all, you know, we're leading towards Remembrance Day, so I think it is important to keep these histories alive and think about them. So thank you so much to Bridget and Saman and to Alumni Affairs, our friends there, for making this talk possible. So have a wonderful day. Thank you.